Welcome to the Kingdom Citizen Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Phillips. We're continuing on with our series, Discipleship in the Kingdom, coming down to life's final discipleship process. We've already considered God's classic discipling process of marriage, parenting, work, and today we're going to address life's final discipleship process, facing death. So, as we get into today's episode, I hope you hear from the Lord. I hope you become even more established in the faith and live out your full potential as a kingdom citizen. Let's go. Okay, welcome to the Kingdom Citizen Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Kevin Phillips. Can't wait to get into today's topic with you. Not because it's not a serious topic, and it's not one we talk about a lot, but I'm excited to get a chance to talk with you because of the benefit that it brings to our life. Today, we're talking about discipleship in the kingdom and continuing on with the classic discipleship processes God uses to build us into kingdom citizens. Today, we're talking about death. I know it's not a great subject to talk about. It's not one you want to really be listening to on your podcast tour from work or out on a nice walk and the cool part of the day. But guys, death is one of God's greatest and classic discipling processes He uses to bring us where He wants us to be. Now, we're not talking about the aspect of death in itself, but we're talking about the process of dying. Truly, the facing of our own mortality that brings us to a point where just the facing of it, the inevitability of it, God uses that as a discipling work in our life to get us ready, not just for eternity, but to get us ready for our walk with Him, living as kingdom citizens right now. And here's the beauty of it. Guys, as we've said in all of our podcasts this season, we've been talking about how these classic great discipling processes, they all start in the garden. And guess what? This one is nonetheless the same. This concept of death and truly the aspect of facing our own mortality goes right back to the garden. Genesis chapter 3, verse 23, it starts by saying this: "For the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life." You know, a lot of times when we read that, it sounds very harsh. That God instituted a death sentence for a seemingly small sin of eating some fruit they weren't supposed to eat. But when you really take a look at this, what God was doing was an act of mercy and love. If He would have left Adam and Eve in their current state with access to the tree of life, they would have remained separated from God indefinitely, continuing on in their sinful state. But God set them apart from that tree of life, put them outside of the garden, and put a discipling process in place of having to face their own mortality and be made right with God. Guys, I want to bring before you right now death and truly facing it, considering it, our own sense of mortality. It's one of God's enduring and final discipling processes in our life. When I was 18 years old, my best friend, my pastor, my grandfather, and my father figure was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. He was put on a heart transplant waiting list and given 1 year to live. I was new to the ministry, and he was my pastor and my mentor. We had a lot of great times during that time. He was not feeling well, but he went into a journey of like never before. Even at 54 years of age, he started off on a journey of having to face his own mortality. You know, at 54, with the wife of his youth, with 4 children that he loved, with a ton of grandkids running around, me being one of them, of different ages, having a thriving ministry and a thriving church that God was blessing, and full of love and friendship in his life. In his mid-50s, he had to face the fact that I may die. So here's what he did. he really taught me the lesson that the facing of death is a discipling process in our life. And to prove it, he started writing a journal. And my aunt, she took it and she put it together in a binder. We called it Dad's Journal. And here's what he just wrote about. Every day he'd write a little bit. And when we read it, it was really a reflection of how man faces his own mortality. As he came into about 6 months of this journey, writing every day about different family members, about his own emotion, his own heart, his ups and his downs, you can see that there was something God wanted to do in Rex Easterling's life through the facing of his own mortality to prepare him in every way that God wanted to prepare him as a kingdom citizen. Remember, he was given a year to live on the heart transplant waiting list. But at 6 months into that, he had a heart attack. And on January 10th, 1993, he lost his life. But he had spent 6 months facing his mortality like never before. It was real. When you have a beeper on your hip, you're on a heart transplant waiting list, and the doctor said you have a year to live, the facing of your mortality is real. It's alive. It's right in your face. The last thing my grandfather had a chance to do was to preach his last sermon on January 3rd, 1993. You know what he preached it on? He preached it on time. I still have the outline of his sermon. Our whole family does. But I was there the day he preached it. And when you think about time and how we use it, how we waste it, how we can't get any more of it, it's a finite resource. Well, my grandpa preached that message on time to his church, which ended up being his last sermon. God moved through it. And it was the last words of a man facing his mortality and expressing to everyone he loved as a pastor, shepherd, as a father, as a husband, as a grandfather, as a friend, to say, this is how God has been sharpening me, how he's been preparing me, how he's been discipling me through the facing of my own mortality. Man, I wish I could take you back to that day. That day, our church of 300, the aisles were packed. I saw more people give their life to Christ in any one day than I'd seen it in my life at that time. I got to counsel with my grandpa's friends' grandkids to give their life to Jesus that day. I got to counsel with people deep in our family who are repenting and turning from their sin that day. It was an awesome, awesome spectacle of a man sharing from his heart the journey of discipleship in facing his own mortality. And for us, when we think about death, we can just brush it under the rug. We can act like it's never going to happen to me. Let me tell you, it's going to happen to all of us. That's one thing we all have in common. The rich, the poor, the high, the low, the black and white, doesn't matter where you come from. We're all going to face it. You know, the scriptures really address this and they point us back to that fact. And I want us to jump into a book of wisdom, a little wisdom poetry, and jump into Ecclesiastes. And I just want to read for you a few scriptures just to kind of get you in. You know, death's not something we like to think about a lot. I don't know if you've contemplated your own mortality in a while. It's kind of something we just push off and know we can't avoid it, but hope we do for as long as we can. And here's what the writer tells us in Ecclesiastes 7:2. He says, it's better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of every man. And here's what he says. Listen, the living should take this to heart. Now, guys, the reason I believe God has put in the contemplation of our own mortality as a classic and great discipling process is just what the writer in Ecclesiastes had to say. Death is the destiny of every man. So while you are living, you should take it to heart. And that's exactly what I want you to do right now. Not the most fun podcasts you'd ever listen to. But listen, we all need to take this to heart. You see, you may not have the opportunity or you may opt out of being married. You may never have the blessing or the desire to raise children. You may be in and out of work or avoided it or didn't see what God was doing in your life work to disciple you and bring you into everything He wants you to be as a kingdom citizen. But here's what I know. We might avoid this one, but God's last and final discipleship process, none of us are going to avoid it. And if we just experience death, we've missed out on the discipling process that facing our mortality is designed to bring in our life. I want to go up to Ecclesiastes again in 9 verse 5. Here's what it says. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no future or further reward, and even the memory of them is forgotten. Their love, their hate, their jealousy have long since vanished, and never again will they have a part in anything that happens under the sun. Guys, this is the season right now to cooperate with God and get in, buy into His discipleship process in the facing, the taking to heart, the considering, the contemplation of your own mortality. Kingdom discipleship is not just using death to get us ready for the kingdom to come when we leave this world, but it's a process God is using right now so that we can live in the full benefit and everything that God has for us as kingdom citizens, citizens of heaven right here and right now. But if we avoid facing our own mortality, if we deny ourselves of understanding and contemplate that one day I will stand before God. One day my days on this earth will be over. One day my opportunity for doing good, my opportunity to laugh and to live and to love and to help and to serve and to work and to raise and to marry. One day all of that's going to be over and I will stand before God. Listen, He wants to use this aspect that our life is finite to bring you to a point to live life, to live kingdom life, to live the God life, to live life and to live it to the full, as Jesus said in John chapter 10, verse 10. Listen, but if we never contemplate, my life on this earth is short, one day it will end, we're going to miss out on everything God has for you in this final and classic discipleship process that He has called death. So I want you to think about this for a second. You know, the Bible says in Romans chapter 14, verse 8, says, if we live to the Lord. Man, I want you to live. I want you to live to the full. That's what kingdom citizens do. But in the facing of our own mortality, we understand this as well. And if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. If our life is His, we want Him to have every aspect of our life under His control and being shaped and molded by Him. And guys, in that process, I remember when I was young, I went to see one of the wealthiest guys I knew. I thought this guy, he had the cattle on 1,000 hills, man. I thought this guy was as rich as all Dallas, and who could have more money than this guy? And I remember going to see him, and he was sick, and people thought he might die. And I went to see him at the hospital, and I thought, man, I wonder what kind of hospital room he's going to have. You know, they'll be doing extra special care of him. And I went to the hospital. You know what? He was laid up in a hospital bed, and he was as helpless and as dependent as anyone could be. And there was someone else in the bed right just over next to him. And I could tell there was a fear that was gripping his life. There was a desperation that he was facing. And that's when I said, death is no respecter of persons. He comes for every one of us, the rich and the poor, the great and the small, no matter where you come from or what your bank account is. When death comes knocking, every person must answer. What I want you to do now as a kingdom citizen and benefit from God's discipling process is not to shy away from facing your own mortality, but to look it right in the eye and contemplate not death, but contemplate life. That life and living it to the full. What my life lives for and what my life matters for right here and right now. How I'm seizing the day today for what today is, letting tomorrow worry about itself. But I'm conscious of the fact that I'll stand before my God one day. My time on this earth will be over. Here's a question I have for you on this. Let's get down to it. When we think about God's discipling process of facing our mortality, here's my questions I have for you. How are you contemplating the fact that one day your life on this earth will be finished and you will be facing God? How are you taking that to heart and considering it? How's God using that as a discipling effort in your life to bring up things and make you aware of things that you don't want to take with you into eternity and you don't want to leave here on earth as a legacy of your life? And one last question I want you to consider as you contemplate your own mortality is, how are you living life and living it to the full, seizing every day while you have it? Well, God is making sure that none of us miss out on his disciple-making processes with these 4 great classic discipling processes that go all the way back to the garden, work throughout the history of life, and are as relevant today for us as they were for those back then. Hey, listen, I hope you've benefited from this series. I hope you're looking at marriage, parenting, work, and our own mortality different than you were before, and considering how God is using all of them to lead you to be the best disciple that you can be and live out your full potential as a kingdom citizen. Send us a review. We'd love to hear what God's been doing over your life these last few weeks. Get in on the conversation by getting in with us on Instagram, and then share this with a friend. I promise you, there are people in your life that will benefit and get a fresh perspective on life and living for Christ when they consider God's great discipling programs and processes for their life. Thanks for tuning in, and go be in it, but not of it.